Congress responded to this chaos with the Radio Act of 1927. As with the earlier Radio Act of 1912, Congress had a choice to make. It could have simply defined property rights and use of the spectrum and ensured an initial distribution of those rights. What emerged was not technical management of the radio spectrum, but far-reaching governmental powers. The 1927 Act precluded private ownership of the radio spectrum. Instead, it created 3-year licenses. The Act specifically asserted that the United States owned and would control the airwaves. The Act also created the Federal Radio Commission, or FRC, a 5-member commission. The FRC was granted the power to classify radio services and to undertake 2 key tasks: to allocate bands of frequencies to different radio services and to assign the frequencies, time of operation, and power level for each individual station. In large part, the Act codified and assigned to the FRC the powers that Secretary Hoover had previously exercised without clear statutory authority under the Radio Act of 1912. The Act also created a different regime for the federal government's use of the spectrum. The President would have the authority to assign frequencies for use within the federal government. The key premise of the 1927 Act was that the government, in controlling uses of the radio spectrum, should ensure that licensees were rendering appropriate service to the public. So in making assignments under the Act, the FRC was obligated to consider whether broadcasters would serve the public convenience, interest, and necessity. One of the key congressional architects of the 1927 Act, Senator Clarence Dill, put it this way: "Of one thing I'm absolutely certain. Uncle Sam should not only police this new beat, he should see to it that no one uses it who's not promised to be good and well behaved." In 1928, the FRC completed a band plan and assigned licenses under the plan. In practice, many licensees returned to their original Commerce Department assignments. The FRC continued to regulate radio until 1934, when Congress passed the Communications Act. That act carried forward the Radio Act of 1927 without any substantive changes, but merged the 1927 statutory provisions with provisions governing telephone and telegraph regulation. The new statute created the Federal Communications Commission, an independent agency with 5 commissioners to oversee both telephone and broadcast regulation. Like the 1927 Act, the Communications Act of 1934 provided a separate institutional regime for government use of the radio spectrum. The assignment of licenses to federal users was placed under the control of the President, who delegated that authority first to the Office of Telecommunications Policy, and then to the Secretary of Commerce and the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA. So let's think about the key decisions that Congress made in the Radio Act of 1927. Congress could have simply provided a mechanism for the FRC to define property rights and use of the radio spectrum and to make an initial distribution of those rights, leaving broadcasters free to transfer their rights and enforce them in the courts. But the government instead adopted a command and control model, under which it would determine who can use the radio spectrum and how. So why did the government take this approach? That's a very controversial question. Some argue that the phenomenon of wireless transmission just wasn't very well understood, even by experts. There was a conviction within the government that heavy regulation was required to ensure maritime safety and to protect the national defense and prevent questionable business practices, including the development of monopoly. That conviction took hold early in radio's history and survived through 1927, despite changes in the market. Others suggest that the Radio Act of 1927 reflects a convergence of governmental and private interests. The government disfavored vesting in private parties any property rights in the radio spectrum, while incumbent broadcasters believed that the government regulation would work in their favor and against new entrants to the broadcast market. As we'll see, some of the fundamental issues concerning spectrum regulation today are the same as they were back in the early days of broadcast. The early Radio Acts confronted such questions as, who owns the radio spectrum? The government? Those who use it? What rules should govern the allocation of spectrum rights to new technology? How should the government assign rights to use the spectrum? Should it give those rights away? Sell them? And at what cost?